President Trump spent part of his weekend in a war of words with basketball superstar LeBron James.
Because that really makes sense, Mika. If you're worried about an upcoming election in Ohio, you want to attack Ohio's favorite son right before that special election.
The president tweeted late Friday night, LeBron James was just interviewed by the dumbest man on television, Don Lemon. He made LeBron look smart, which isn't easy to do. I like Mike, a reference to Michael Jordan. The tweet followed an interview by Lemon of James of the new school for at-risk children that LeBron had just opened in his hometown of Akron, Ohio. The interview included James' negative assessment of the president, saying Trump kind of used sports to kind of divide us. In the wake of the president's tweet, James has received a wave of support, including from Michael Jordan. A spokesman for the NBA legend tells NBC News that he supports James, adding that he is doing an amazing job for his community. And it appears James may have support from at least one person in the White House.
Oh, yeah.
First Lady Melania Trump commended James on his school, saying in a statement that she'd be open to visiting the facility. Her spokeswoman maintained in a further statement that Ms. Trump was not taking sides on the matter.
That's kind of like the United States saying. It's kind of like the United States saying on, December 8th, 1941, we're not taking sides in the matter.
Just over 5 years ago, Donald Trump had nothing but praise for James, tweeting congratulations to King James on winning Athlete of the Year in last night's ESPYs. LeBron is also a great guy, Joe.
Yeah,
great guy.
Eddie Glaude, you could almost hear, this guy sounded like an old, grumpy, white, racist grandpa in Queens or in Alabama, yelling at his TV set, saying, this black man is stupid. That black man is stupid. I mean, first you would say, well, gee, boy, he's really losing it, because who would be that racially insensitive to do that? But no, it actually is his strategy. It was with NFL players. It is with NBA players. It's what Donald Trump thinks, and he's told his staff members. Basically, attacking black athletes, that's really good for me. That's really good politically going into the midterms.
I think you're absolutely right, Joe. Remember the speech in Alabama when he went after NFL players and called them SOBs. It's a sense in which Trump is always most comfortable, especially when he's in trouble, to be the kind of cultural warrior that speaks to, in some ways, the dark underside of the country. In this instance, to go after LeBron really reveals, I think, very clearly a pattern that kind of speaks to his ongoing belief about black folks and women in particular, because he has a penchant to describe black people as dumb. He has a tendency to describe women as dumb, thinking not just simply Maxine Waters, but women generally, right? So it seems to me this is just Trump being the cultural warrior. And the irony, of course, is that this is the man who founded Trump University, right? This fraudulent thing, and here's LeBron James opening up a public school in Cleveland, right? So you couldn't get a better contrast of moral human beings.
Well, in every phase of their life, Mike Barnicle. And by the way, Melania's spokesperson can say that she wasn't trying to get involved, but she got involved in the middle of it and chose the side of LeBron.
Yeah, but Joe, this gets to what we were talking about before the break and what Eddie just spoke about. I mean, race remains now and forever the third rail of American life, not American politics. And we really don't have a handle on it. And we have a leader, the ostensible leader of the United States of America, the President of the United States, who continually plays with it and provokes people with it, and it's truly dangerous, and it's going to end even more badly than it already is right now.
It would be bad enough if it were restricted to African American athletes and to African American women, female members of Congress like Maxine Waters. But you think about it, it's like, you got Barack Obama, first African American president of the United States. Oh, he's from Kenya. Maxine Waters, she's an idiot. Don Lemon, he's an idiot. Black athletes, they're all SOBs. The Central Park Five, guilty.
Yeah.
Black African countries, S-holes. If you think of anything in political life, cultural life, global life that associates itself with people of dark pigmentation, the President of the United States thinks they're idiots, evil, fraudulent. It's not just a pattern that extends just to the fact that he's obviously Mau-Mauing Colin Kaepernick and African-American NFL players and LeBron James now. But he doesn't just restrict himself to one species of African-American or one category of African-American. If you're black, the president takes a crap all over you publicly, and this gets to your point about toxins. It's the most consistent thing in his public profile. You can't find...
He's injected it.
Yeah, other than Don King, you can't find an African-American that the president has any respect for.
Yeah, it's such a turn, too, to his private life before he was in politics, and when he actually... both personally and professionally, had friends, had acquaintances in the black community. And, you can talk to Reverend Al about it. You can talk to a lot of entertainers about it. So it is this calculated, cynical, David Duke-like use of racism for political gain. But that, as Meacham always says, it may be a good starter, but it's a terrible finisher. And you don't have to go back that far, John Heilemann, to predict to see what's happened in the past, predict what's going to happen in the future. Go back to Doug Jones's special election in Alabama. I think one of the most remarkable statistics that I've seen in quite some time is the fact that more Alabama black voters across what they call the Black Belt in central Alabama,
right.
A higher percentage of black voters came out to vote for Doug Jones in that special election than voted for Barack Obama in 2008 and 12 percentage-wise. That's unheard of. Right. It is historic. It's probably never happened before. And Donald Trump is the reason it happened.
Well, right. And Joe, and I'll ask Eddie about this, but the president thinks that this strategy helps with his base, clearly. But first of all, I think there's plenty of evidence just to suggest that Donald Trump's a stone-cold racist. But beyond that, there's the politics of it. He thinks it helps with his base. But as Joe points out, for every angry, dispossessed, or seemingly dispossessed, self-pitying white voter who likes the fact that Donald Trump takes on every African-American in sight, there's an African-American voter, often an African-American female voter, as we saw in Alabama, who is equally inflamed by Donald Trump's behavior towards African-Americans and towards his tolerance towards and even praise for white nationalists and neo-Nazis, for instance, in Charlottesville, Virginia.
And we saw those numbers, we saw that evidenced in Alabama and Virginia, right?
Yep.
But I think it's really important that we not just simply think about Donald Trump appealing to a racist base. He sits in the sweet spot between loud racist, the soft bigotry of liberals, and the contradictions of American capitalism. And what do I mean by that? So so the loud racist, when he sends out that bone, when he throws out the red meat, it's okay, right? That speaks to him, right? And it's easy for us to condemn him. But the soft bigotry, that's the silent majority. Right? Those are those folks who believe that big government's taking money from hard-working white people and giving it to undeserving brown people. These are the folks who want to keep their neighborhoods the way they are. They want to keep their schools good. These are the folks who are making decisions that aren't overtly racist. They are actually committed to racial equality, but according to social science data, they are very skeptical of policies that will actually remedy racial inequality. And then you have the kind of contradictions. The folk who are working their behinds off in rural America, the folks who are working their behinds off with 3 jobs in urban America who can't make ends meet. And Donald Trump sits right in that sweet spot. And every time he engages in the cultural war, he's throwing a bone to the loud racists, but he's also nestling into that spot. And so it's easy for us to think that we can just denounce him as the loud racist. But that's not the source of his power. The source of his power is that he sits at the intersection of all 3 of those things, in my view.
Well, and he uses his power, this president, to create a policy that separates children from their families and then attacks an African-American sports hero who creates a school for at-risk families. The whole thing is beyond ludicrous at this point and really sad, to use the president's little term. Sad. Still ahead, from the very start of his presidency, Donald Trump has muddied what should have been a clear message. Russia interfered. Now the Washington Post is taking a deep dive into what exactly happened in 2016, and that is coming up next.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.